Iran just launched missiles, not at Israeli soldiers, not at a military base, but at the factories that build the weapons designed to shoot down Iranian missiles. Think about the chess move buried inside that for a second. By the end of this video, you'll understand why one obscure commodity sitting deep inside Israel's defense supply chain just quietly surged, and why, right now, it matters more than the oil price headlines everyone's chasing. The strike that changed the geometry of this war didn't happen on a battlefield. On March 1st, 2026, Iran's IRGC fired Fattah, 2 hypersonic missiles directly at 2 facilities, Rafael Advanced Defense Systems and Israel Aerospace Industries, the Arrow 2, Arrow 3, and David Sling systems. This wasn't a battlefield strike. This was a production line strike. Before we get to the markets, you need to understand what was actually fired because the financial stakes change completely once you realize what the Fattah 2 is and what its critics say it isn't. Iran unveiled the Fattah 2 in November 2023 as the successor to the Fattah 1. Tehran claims it features a hypersonic glide vehicle capable of reaching Mach 15 and striking targets up to 1,400 kilometers away. Western analysts are skeptical of the hypersonic label specifically, arguing it's more accurately a maneuverable re-entry vehicle, or MARV, using a second-stage aerodynamic control system rather than a true glide vehicle in the conventional sense. But here's the thing. That classification debate is irrelevant to the market. What matters to traders, to defense procurement officers, and to the US? Senators who control the defense budget is a much simpler question. Can the Arrow 3 or THAAD actually intercept it at scale? The Fattah 2 reportedly travels between Mach 5 and Mach 20 depending on flight phase. At that speed, the reaction window collapses to seconds, and each one of these missiles costs Iran approximately $200,000 to produce. Compare that to a single Tomahawk cruise missile at over $3 million per unit. According to reporting from Military Watch magazine, the United States burned through more than 25% of the entire global THAAD arsenal, spending over $2 billion, defending Israel across just 11 days of mid-intensity combat. Iran is fighting a cost war, and right now, on that metric, they're winning. Now, let's talk crude, because Brent just did something that almost nobody on Wall Street was modeling 6 months ago. On March 18th, 2026, Brent crude spiked more than 5% in a single session to nearly $110 a barrel, triggered by Israeli and American strikes on Iran's South Pars gas field, the single largest natural gas reserve on Earth. But that $110 number is only shocking if you miss the full trajectory. According to Fortune, Brent has surged roughly 80% since the conflict began on February 28th, driven primarily by the near-total shutdown of tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point that handles approximately 20% of all global oil and gas flows. In the opening days of the conflict alone, crude surged 10 to 13%, landing briefly around $80 to $82 before continuing its climb. And then the IRGC made a statement that markets had to take seriously. Iranian commander said on the record that they would not allow a liter of oil through the strait. Capital Economics ran the numbers. If this conflict sustains for 3 months, Brent could average $150 per barrel across the following 6-month window. The IRGC's own number, $200 a barrel. Nobody's laughing at that figure anymore. And while everyone fixated on crude, the LNG story was quietly becoming its own catastrophe. LNG prices have risen nearly 60% since hostilities began. On March 2nd, Qatar Energy suspended LNG production following an Iranian drone strike. Qatar supplies roughly 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas. When Qatar's foreign ministry condemned Israeli strikes on the South Pars gas field as a dangerous and irresponsible step, that was diplomatic language for something much more alarming. 2 of the world's largest LNG exporters are now directly inside the blast radius of this conflict. The downstream consequences are landing hardest in Asia. Japan sources approximately 90% of its crude from the Middle East. South Korea routes more than 95% of its 70% Middle East-dependent crude supply directly through Hormuz. Seoul's response was immediate. A $100 trillion market stabilization program, the equivalent of roughly $68 billion, activated almost overnight. These aren't abstract figures. These are countries running emergency protocols because the energy artery they depend on has been effectively severed. But the energy story, as wild as it is, was only half the picture, because what Iran just did to Rafael's factory changes something much darker in the global defense market. Rafael Advanced Defense Systems and Israel Aerospace Industries are not listed on any stock exchange. You can't buy a share of either company, but their supply chains run directly through some of the biggest publicly traded defense names in the world, and the implications of this strike are starting to show up in some uncomfortable places. If Rafael and IAI cannot manufacture new Iron Dome and Arrow interceptors fast enough to replace what's being consumed in this conflict, demand for US-made THAAD and Patriot systems surges. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, These companies are suddenly staring at a demand curve that nobody planned for. Rafael's own VP for air defense, Yuval Beisky, described hypersonic missiles as representing a new era in air defense and warned that building out a zone-based interception model capable of stopping Fattah II-class weapons could take years and tens of billions of dollars. Let that sink in. The company that builds Israel's shields is saying publicly that the solution to this new threat is still years away. So yes, Iran just struck the factory that makes the missiles that stop Iranian missiles, and the companies benefiting financially are American defense contractors. That is the uncomfortable irony sitting at the center of this story. While defense stocks found reasons for cautious optimism, global equity markets were having a completely different experience. Since February 28th, global stocks have fallen 5.5%. The NYSE composite dropped 6%. The Nasdaq shed 2.4% by early March. Capital has been sprinting toward traditional safe havens, gold, the US dollar, short duration treasuries. Asian markets bore the worst of the early contagion, with Tokyo, Seoul, and Hong Kong all opening sharply lower after Wall Street's losses cascaded overnight. Economists are now using language that hasn't been deployed seriously since the 1970s. Stagflation risk, supply shock, inflationary recession. If the strait remains effectively closed for another month, these aren't tail risks anymore. They become base case. Here's what mainstream financial media almost completely missed, and it's the story that explains that commodity callback. From the opening, Gulf countries produce approximately 45% of the world's sulfur supply. With the Hormuz blockade disrupting shipping lanes, that sulfur supply has effectively paused, and the knock-on effects are running directly into fertilizer pricing, metal leaching costs in the copper industry, and the global supply of sulfuric acid. That's significant. But the commodity nobody is talking about is helium. The Gulf is a major producer of helium, the inert gas that is absolutely non-negotiable in semiconductor fabrication, MRI machines, and fiber optic manufacturing. There is no substitute. There is no synthetic alternative at industrial scale. If Gulf helium supply stays disrupted, this doesn't just hit energy markets. It reaches into the semiconductor supply chain, the same supply chain already strained by ongoing geopolitical tension in East Asia. That's the commodity from the opening, helium. And almost nobody has written a word about it. Let's put this moment in historical context, because the parallel is striking, and the differences are just as important as the similarities. In 1973, OPEC's Arab members cut oil exports to the United States and Western Europe in retaliation for support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Prices quadrupled, the US entered a recession. The embargo lasted 5 months and reshaped the entire architecture of Western energy policy for a generation. Neil Atkinson, former head of oil industry at the International Energy Agency, called the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz something energy markets had never seen before, warning that without a rapid resolution, the world faces a potentially game-changing and unprecedented energy crisis. The critical difference from 1973 is that the United States is now an energy exporter. American producers actually benefit from elevated prices, but America's closest allies, Japan, South Korea, Germany, are not exporters. They are completely exposed. Meanwhile, according to analysis from Kepler, this conflict is materially improving Russia's competitive position in global crude markets, with both India and China having strong structural incentives to deepen their dependence on Russian supply. In 1973, the weapon was an export ban. In 2026, the weapon is a missile and a geographic choke point. So what are the 3 signals analysts are actually watching right now? First, whether the IEA's coordinated release of 400 million barrels from strategic petroleum reserves, representing roughly 20 days of typical Hormuz throughput, can hold Brent below $110, or whether the sustained closure pushes prices toward the IRGC's stated $200 target. Second, the U.S. Navy's posture in the Strait. U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright stated publicly that Washington was not ready to provide naval escorts through Hormuz, but added that such operations could begin by end of the month. That is the sentence markets are waiting on. Third, and most quietly, whether Rafael and IAI can rebuild, relocate, or disperse their production lines fast enough to prevent Israel's interceptor inventory from reaching a critical threshold. Because if that inventory runs thin, this conflict enters a phase nobody has fully priced in yet. Iran didn't just fire a missile at a building. It fired a missile at a concept. The concept that Israel's air defense shield is inexhaustible and perpetually self-replenishing. So here's the question for the comments. If Iran can now target the factory that builds the interceptors designed to stop Iranian missiles, what exactly is the long-term foundation of Israel's air defense strategy? Because that answer has trillion-dollar consequences, and right now, nobody seems to have it. If this video just changed the way you see this conflict, hit that like button right now, because the YouTube algorithm buries videos like this, and the only way this information reaches people who actually need to hear it is if you push it. Subscribe if you're not already in. We go deeper than the headlines every single time. And drop your answer in the comments. Do you think the Strait of Hormuz reopens before oil hits $150? Or are we already past the point of no return? I read every comment. See you in the next one.